morning of the day that Jesus died, if he had slept at all, he woke up in this room, and the only way to exit was to go back through the hole into which he was lowered. The Jewish council met on this very spot at the court of the Sanhedrin. They wanted to put Jesus to death, so the Jewish leaders took Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, hoping to convince him to execute Jesus. The ancient historians Josephus and Philo suggest that the place where Pontius Pilate was staying was at the Grand Palace in Jerusalem. And if that is true, Jesus could have stood before Pilate in this very room. Judas Iscariot immediately realized that his teacher was not going to resist the Jews, nor start a revolution. For this, he felt great remorse and committed to take his own life on this very spot. Pilate asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews. Jesus replied by saying, "You have said correctly that I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world." It is also recorded that Jesus said nothing in his defense. He was the only man in history who was born to die. Trying to pass the responsibility off to someone else, Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas. Historians tell us that Herod Antipas was staying at a place called the Hasmonean Palace. Jesus did not answer a single question from Herod and was sent back to Pilate. Pilate then assumed that simply flogging Jesus was the solution to his dilemma. The pillar to which Jesus was bound at that time had been seen in the upper room by the Spanish pilgrim Egeria back in 384 AD. The Church of Jerusalem never let that pillar out of their sight, which is why it is still with us today. During the Passover, the Romans had a tradition of liberating one prisoner. Pilate gave the crowd that gathered at his court the choice as to which prisoner that should be. The Jewish leaders persuaded the crowd to ask for the release of a notorious criminal named Barabbas. According to an ancient tradition, both Jesus and Barabbas were being held simultaneously in the same dungeon. That same tradition recalls that Jesus was bound in these leg stocks. Pilate was out of options. His fifth and final attempt to relieve himself of the blame for Jesus' death had him washing his hands and giving in to the demand of the Jews. Now the Roman soldiers were brutes. Even after they had severely beaten Jesus, they continued their assaults with blows to his face, with a crown of thorns, and with more beatings across his body. And the Church of Jerusalem passed down a tradition that Jesus was slumped against this pillar as he was assaulted and spit upon. An ancient tradition tells us that the wood from which his cross was made came from an orchard that once grew at this location. The path that Jesus followed as he carried the cross is called the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Sorrows. And there are several stations along this road which mark both biblical and traditional events that occurred as Jesus made his way to the place where he died. Jesus was not crucified within the walls of the city, but on the outside. To leave the city, he must have gone through a gate. That gate is right here, and its lower threshold is still visible to this day. Only a few more agonizing steps took Jesus to the place that we call Mount Calvary, but the Jews had another name for it. They called it Golgotha, the place of the skull.